Hello students, welcome to EPG Patsala. I am Dr. Prasanna Kumar Patra from Utkal University, Bhubaneswar. Today we will discuss the module General Concepts of Epidemiology Part 1 from the paper Human Growth and Nutrition. Let's see what we are going to learn from this module. Understand the basic concept in epidemiology with examples and define descriptive and analytical epidemiology. Characterize the population perspective. Apply the population perspective to an understanding of the global burden of health outcomes and diseases. Differentiating the following measures like prevalence, risk, rate, and odds. Calculate the following measures: prevalence, risk, rate, and odds. Define the concept of person time and be able to apply this to calculations of rates. Choose the measures of frequency appropriate for a given situation. Interpret prevalence, risk, rate, and odds within the context of epidemiology. With the shift in disease prevalence from infectious to chronic diseases like heart diseases, cancer, diabetes, etc., and the development of complex models to explain this shift, the single agent model of epidemiology failed to explain the complex web of biological, behavioral, environmental factors which led to the development of these chronic diseases. This led to the importance of introducing anthropological approach in understanding the subjective reasons for the failure of a particular health initiative. The demand for anthropological input in public health emerged less from the academic epidemiology and more from the limitations that professionals in leading organizations such as the World Health Organization and bilateral donor agencies experienced when relying solely on epidemiology for improving program development, evaluation, and implementation. As a result, a certain template for expected ways of collaboration developed. Most commonly, applied epidemiological projects now generally incorporate sub-studies based on use of qualitative methods, usually in a so-called formative phase, to be carried out by anthropologists. In this template, the anthropologist's role has consisted largely of helping epidemiologists adapt standardized measurement tools to specific contexts, providing a descriptive narrative of patients' subjective experiences or explaining the reasons for the failure of a particular programmatic initiative. Therefore, it is necessary for anthropologists to understand the concept of epidemiology in order to make better collaboration between the two disciplines. This module would help us in understanding basic concept of epidemiology followed by calculation of various risk estimates. Introduction to epidemiology. The word epidemiology comes from the Greek word epi means on or open. Demos means people and logos means the study of. Epidemiology is the study of how often diseases occur in different groups of people and why. Epidemiological information is used to plan and evaluate strategies to prevent illness and as a guide to management of patients in whom disease has already developed. Many definitions have been proposed to define scope of epidemiology. Here are two that captures the underlying principles and spirit of epidemiology. The first, epidemiology is the study of distribution and determinants of health-related states or events in specified populations and the application of this study to the control of health problems. This was given by Last J.M. in 1995. The second definition is epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of disease frequency in man. This was given by McMahon and Poo in 1970. These definitions of epidemiology include several terms which reflect some of the important principles of the discipline. That is, study. Epidemiology is a scientific discipline and has at its foundation sound methods of scientific inquiry. Description. Epidemiology is concerned with the frequency and pattern of health events in a population. Epidemiology focuses at population level rather than individual level. Frequency includes not only the number of such events in a population, but also the rate or risk of disease in the population. Pattern refers to occurrence of health-related events by time, place, and personal characteristics. Epidemiology is a quantitative discipline built on a working knowledge of probability, statistics, and sound research methods. B. A method of causal reasoning based on developing and testing hypotheses pertaining to occurrence and prevention of morbidity and mortality. And C. A tool for public health action to promote and protect the public's health based on science, causal reasoning, and a dose of practical common sense. Population perspective of epidemiology. Epidemiology focuses on population perspective rather than individual or biomedical perspective. Its main focus is on social, psychological, and environmental factors that are associated with health outcome. The occurrence of health outcomes or disease in population is impacted by immediate causal agents as well as other factors. For example, housing condition in which people live can influence their health. Population perspective help researchers to understand what specific factors affects the health of the population. Population perspective look at proximal or downstream or distal upstream factors in order to understand the exact causes of disease. Proximal or micro-level factors and includes physiological and biological factors such as genetic makeup, age, ethnicity, gender, and immune status. Downstream determinants typically are related to diseases and illnesses. Risk factors that cannot be changed can be used to identify groups of people at increased risk and to develop targeted interventions. Distal or upstream factors are macro-level factors such as global forces and government policies. Upstream approaches try to prevent health problems at the source so they do not need to be fixed down the stream. Factors such as community design, education, employment, living and working conditions, and poverty are major determinants of health that can be addressed at upstream level. Population perspective refers to a web of causation where many factors play a role in the disease development. Factors including family support, social network, global climate, labor conditions, and advertisement all play part in disease occurrence and therefore should be considered when deciding a public health intervention. All epidemiological research involve some sort of population, and every population has its own history, culture, economic and social context, which could explain how and why people are exposed to risk factors and how people are affected by their exposure. Population research begins by considering the distribution and determinants of health outcomes at the population level. But population research may also include individual and micro-level analysis. Any understanding of this historical and social context health outcomes help in conducting effective research and in designing effective interventions. History of epidemiology. In order to understand the field of epidemiology, it is first helpful to review some of the basic history of the field. People have long viewed epidemics of disease and plagues as terrifying occurrences. There has been continued desire to have a more rational and complete way to understand diseases and health outcomes rather than just believing in diseases were simply caused by spirits or God. These empirical observations of epidemics and other causes of mortality were the beginning of the field of epidemiology. The history of epidemiology has involved many key players who advanced the study of disease from a supernatural point of view to a viewpoint based on scientific evidence. The Greek physician Hippocrates in 460 to 377 BC, also known as the father of medicine, and was the first epidemiologist. He was the first person known to have examined the relationships between the occurrence of disease and environmental influences. However, the epidemiologic knowledge advanced slowly during next 2000 years. Dr. John Snow, who investigated into the causes of the 19th century cholera epidemics, is known as the father of modern epidemiology. His identification of the contaminated water as the cause of the Soho epidemic is considered the classic example of epidemiology. He used chlorine in an attempt to clear the water, thus ending the outbreak. This has been perceived as a major event in the history of public health and regarded as the founding event of the science of epidemiology, having helped shape public health policies around the world. Epidemiology's focus was initially on infectious diseases until early in the 20th century. If you look at the figure, it describes the focus was just on infectious diseases and epidemic in mid-1800. Epidemiology began to focus on infectious disease overall in the mid-1900s. By the mid-1950s, epidemiology focus then included not just infectious disease but specific conditions associated with them. In the 1960s, epidemiology began to focus on laws regarding distribution of disease at a community level. Towards the end of 20th century, computers, increasing information technology, and the new methodological approaches altered the field of epidemiology. Epidemiology has become standard area of clinical science and is the most fundamental basic science of public health. In late 1980s, epidemiology focused on how to control or minimize health problems and diseases. Subfield of epidemiology. Epidemiology has numerous subfields concentrating on specific approaches or types of disease. Many epidemiologists focus on specific areas of study such as 1. Infectious epidemiology. It is the epidemiological study of infectious or communicable diseases. Through the beginning of 20th century, infectious diseases were considered to be the most important global health problem. Infectious diseases are caused by an infectious agent or by the product of infectious agent. Such an infection is due to transmission of the agent from an infected individual, animal, or reservoir to a susceptible host. 2. Chronic diseases epidemiology. It is the study of diseases or conditions that have a prolonged duration such as heart diseases, epilepsy, diabetes, cancer, stroke, arthritis, glaucoma, etc. Over time, there has been a change in epidemiology to also focus on study of chronic diseases. 3. Maternal and child health epidemiology. It focuses on improving the health and well-being of women, children, and families and investigating risk factors for health outcomes that especially affects women and children. 4. Injury and accident epidemiology. It is a very important issue in public health. However, epidemiology and scientific method for the study of injuries and injury control were only really developed beginning in the late 1960s. Urbanization and work in factories increased during Industrial Revolution and led to increase in work-related accidents and injuries. 5. Environmental epidemiology focuses environmental exposures or factors that affects health outcomes. Examples of environmental factors or exposures include chemical or physical agents, microbiological pathogens, social conditions that can affect environmental exposure and climate change. Number 6. Nutritional epidemiology. It examines associations between nutrition and health outcomes. Research studies may focus on diet and physical activity. For example, recent studies have shown that food allergies are increasing. The number of children with food allergies has increased by 18% from 1997 to 2007, according to US Center for Disease Control and Prevention or CDC. Health policy epidemiology. Knowledge gained from epidemiologic studies can be used when planning for health outcomes and disease control programs and for policies at both individual and population level. Public health policy decisions should be evidence-based and epidemiologic studies can provide this needed evidence. Example of area of health policy includes medical research policy, pharmaceutical policies, vaccine policy, tobacco control policy, breastfeeding promotion policy. Health behavior epidemiology focuses on research of distribution and determinants of health behaviors and evaluates interventions and services for behaviors such as substance abuse or psychiatric disorder, and also how health behaviors and policies are associated with communicable diseases such as tuberculosis, HIV, and other sexually transmitted infections. An understanding of how behavior affects health promotion and disease prevention is important. Molecular epidemiology refers to applications of molecular technique and genetic technique to the study of the occurrence of disease and the mechanism of disease in the population. For example, some important work has been done on genetic factors in cancer and how those relate to the occurrence of disease in population. Clinical epidemiology refers to the application of epidemiology to specific clinical problems. An example would be if an individual is administered a specific treatment, what is the likelihood that individual will survive? Another aspect of clinical epidemiology is the use of screening tests to refer individuals for diagnostic workup. Then, the social epidemiology often draws upon the tools of sociology and social sciences in order to explain the occurrence of disease in populations. Examples of issues related to social epidemiology include how diseases vary according to social class and status hierarchy. Descriptive and analytic epidemiology. Descriptive epidemiology. It describes the distribution of disease through describing a condition by various characteristics of person, place, and time. Personal characteristics include demographic factors such as age, race, sex, marital status, and socio-economic status, as well as behaviors such as occupation or risk-taking activity, resulting in environmental exposures. Place characteristics include geographic variation, urban-rural differences, and location of work sites or schools. Time characteristics include annual occurrence, seasonal occurrence, and daily or even hourly occurrence. It is the first stage in an epidemiologic study in which a disease that has occurred is examined. When we ask what is the distribution or pattern of diseases or health outcome in a population, we are talking about descriptive epidemiology. Descriptive epidemiology deals with the frequency and distribution of disease or risk factors in the population. Descriptive epidemiology can be used for hypothesis generation, but usually cannot be used to test hypotheses. Descriptive epidemiology can be used to evaluate trends in disease, health, and risk factors such as smoking, or determine if a health status is improving or getting worse. Also, to determine if new diseases are occurring and provide factual basis for evaluating public health programs and services, and to identify the problems to be studied by analytic epidemiology. Analytic epidemiology. It aims to research and study risk factors and preventive risk factors for diseases. It is applied to understand the underlying causes of the pattern of diseases or health outcome and investigate the causes. Use of comparison group is the key of analytic epidemiology. For example, study on the causes of obesity would study dietary differences between two or more comparison groups. Understanding measures of disease frequency. One is the introduction to disease frequency. The essence of epidemiology is to measure the distribution and determinants of disease or outcomes frequency in human populations in order to control health problems. Thus, the objectives of epidemiology are to determine the extent of disease in a population, identify patterns and trends of disease occurrence, identify the causes or exposures of disease, and evaluate the effectiveness of prevention and treatment activities. Measuring how often a disease arises in a population is usually the first step in achieving these goals. These measures are called measures of disease frequency. Because epidemiology is concerned with the occurrence of disease in groups of people rather than in individuals, populations are at the heart of epidemiology measurements. A population can be defined as a group of people with a common characteristics such as place of residence, religion, gender, age, use of hospital services, or life events such as giving birth. Epidemiologists must always consider three factors when they measure how commonly a disease occurs in a group of people. They are: 1. The number of people that are affected by the disease; 2. The size of population from which the cases of disease arise; and 3. The length of time that the population is followed. Failure to consider all three components will give a false impression about the impact of the disease on a population. 2. Measures of disease frequency. The two basic measures of disease frequency in epidemiology are incidence and prevalence. Incidence measures the occurrence of new disease, and prevalence measures in existence of current disease. Each measure describes an important part of the natural course of a disease. Incidence deals with the transition from health to disease, and prevalence focuses on the period of time that a person lives with a disease. First is incidence. Incidence is defined as the occurrence of new cases of disease that develop in a candidate population over a specified time period. There are three key ideas in this definition. First, incidence measures new disease events. For diseases that can occur more than once, it usually measures the first occurrence of the disease. Second, new cases of disease are measured in a candidate population, which is a population of people who are at risk of getting the disease. Someone is at risk because he or she has the appropriate body organ, is not immune, and so forth. For example, a woman who still has an intact uterus, that is, she has not undergone a hysterectomy, is a candidate for getting uterine cancer, and a child who has not been fully immunized against the poliovirus is a candidate for contracting poliomyelitis. Third, incidence takes into account the specific amount of time that the members of the population are followed until they develop the disease. Because incidence measures a person's transition from a healthy to a disease state, time must pass for this change to occur and be observed. Incidence is calculated as number of new cases during a period of time divided by number of candidate population during a specified
period of time.
Prevalence is one of the most common epidemiologic measures you see in your daily news. For example, you may see a news headline based on prevalence measure such as the proportion of people that are overweight. Newspaper headlines: approximately 12% of world population is obese. Malaria infects 10% of world population. While incident measures the frequency with which new disease develops, prevalence measures the frequency of existing disease. It is simply defined as the proportion of total population that is diseased. There are two types of prevalence measures: point prevalence and period prevalence, that relate to prevalence to different amounts of time. Point prevalence refers to the proportion of population that is diseased and a single point in time and can be thought of as a single snapshot of the population. Whereas the point can be either a particular calendar date, such as December 1, 2005, or a point in someone's life, such as college graduation. Period prevalence refers to the proportion of the population that is deceased during a specified duration of time, such as during the year 2005. The period prevalence includes the number of cases that were present at the start of the period, for example, January 1st, 2005, as well as the number that developed during the period, for example, January 2nd through December 31st, 2005. It may be helpful to think of period prevalence as derived from a series of snapshots. Mathematically, point prevalence and period prevalence are expressed as follows. Point prevalence is defined as the number of defined cases during a period of time divided by number of persons in a defined population during a period of time.
The denominator of the calculation. The denominator should represent the people who could have the disease or health outcome in the study population. To give an example, of 10,000 female residents in town A on 1st January 2015, 1,000 have hypertension. The point prevalence of hypertension among women in town A on this date is calculated as 1,000 that have hypertension is divided by the total population, that is 10,000, is equivalent to 0.1 or 10%. Thus, the prevalence of hypertension on January 1st, 2015 was 10%. Here, you can look at the figure to understand incident cases versus prevalent cases. Imagine a pot partially filled with water, as shown in figure 1. Each drop of water in pot represents an existing case of the health outcome or disease. These are prevalent cases. The total capacity of the pot represents total population at risk of disease. If we add more water to bucket, then the new drops are incident cases. Any water that drains out or leaves the pot represents death or recovery. So, to briefly summarize, the difference between prevalent cases and incident cases are that incident cases are new cases of disease and prevalent cases include existing and new cases of disease. The formula for calculating risk is the number of new cases or incident cases in specified time period divided by total number of at-risk individuals. Risk measures the number of new cases of the health outcome or disease that develop among the people in the population at risk over a specific time period. Risk refers to probability that a disease will occur. Risk can be expressed as proportion and ranges from 0% to 100%. Why to measure risk? We use risk as measure for several reasons. It's fairly easy to calculate and interpret risk. It has clear meaning to clinicians and lay people, and patients understand basic percentage. Rates. Rate measures occurrence of new cases of a disease in a population. It is not same as proportion because denominator is not fixed. Instead, rate accounts for realistic situation in which population is changing over time. Population at risk change due to changes such as births, deaths, and migration. In a study population, a person can decide to longer participate in study population. Thus, some people may be lost to follow up during the course of study. In order to take this change in account, rates take in account the sum of time called person time that each person remains at risk for that disease under study observation.
Disadvantage of using rates. The reason we do not use rates all the time because rate data can be more costly and difficult to collect. How to calculate rates? First step is to define study population. The first step to calculate rate is to define the study population. Second step is determine new cases. Then to determine the number of new cases of disease. And the third step is to determine the denominator, that is person time at risk. Rate is defined as the number of new cases or incident cases in specified time period divided by total person time at risk. The incident rate is the rate of contracting the disease among those still at risk. When a study subject develops the disease, dies, or leaves the study, they are no longer at risk and will no longer contribute person time units at risk. Calculation of person time at risk. The denominator in an incident rate is the sum of each individual's time at risk and is commonly expressed in person time at risk. Person time is the sum of time that each person remain at risk for the disease or health outcome under the study observation. Person time can be expressed in units of person years, person months, person days, or some other scales. A person in the study can stop contributing person time for a variety of reasons such as deaths, leaving the study, or moving to different country, or the person develops the disease or health outcome during study, or the researcher is unable to follow up with them. The use of person time as opposed to just time enable one to handle situations in which people die or migrate out of the study population or where they are drop out in a study and where you have not been able to follow your entire study population at risk to watch for development of the disease under investigation. Thus, the follow-up period does not need to be uniform for all participants. Person time for a group is the sum of the times of follow-up for each participant in that group.
Here, you are given an example of person time or years at risk for 5 individuals in a hypothetical cohort study between 2000 and 2004, where dotted lines are time at risk, X is disease, L is person lost to follow-up. This figure illustrates the calculation of person time units in years at risk of a hypothetical population of 5 individuals in a 5-year cohort study. In the above example, the incident rate of disease X is calculated as rate is the number of new cases or incident cases in specified time period divided by total person time at risk. Rate is 3 by 18 is equal to 0.167 per person year or 16.7 per 100 person years. Note that for most rare diseases, risks and rates are numerically similar because the number at risk will approximately equal the total population at all times. Odds. In statistics, we refer odds as the ratio of the probability that an event, such as a disease, will occur to the probability that the event, such as disease, will not occur. Odds are used in epidemiology because of their convenient mathematical properties. If we use P as the symbol for probability, then the mathematical formula for calculating odds is P divided by 1 minus P. The advantages of odds are easy to calculate and interpret. Odds tend to have more meaning to clinicians and laypersons compared to rates. Odds can be used to provide information to patients in clinical settings since it can be easily understood. So students, let us summarize what we learned in this module. We discussed about the basic concept and history of epidemiology. We have also discussed various subfields of epidemiology such as infectious epidemiology, chronic diseases epidemiology, maternal and child health epidemiology, environmental epidemiology, nutritional epidemiology, health policy epidemiology, health behavior epidemiology, and so on. We have also discussed about the measures of disease frequency with various examples. Thank you.